If you were to poll random NBA fans on the most infamous refs of all time, you'd be hard-pressed to see names like Tim Donaghy or Joey Crawford not top the list. What if I told you there was a ref who caused even more turmoil to the league? In fact, his actions almost killed the NBA entirely. The NBA doesn't hand out lifetime bans on a whim. Over the course of the league's 75-year history, 103 lifetime bans have been handed out, with 9 eventually overturned. At the time of this video's release, arguably the most infamous might be the most recent one, Jontay Porter. As we look through the history of banned players, modern incidents are few and far between. But what about the first member of the NBA fraternity that was banished for life, and the only referee to make that list? It's time to meet Sol Levy, the most corrupt ref in NBA history. In the year 1951, the NBA had only turned the ripe age of 2. After starting with 17 franchises in 49, the league had been whittled down to 11. 3 years away from the shot clock era, the league was dominated by the slow but methodical George Mikan. Mikan's biggest challenge on the court wasn't his competitors, but it was the refs calling the game. If Mikan played more than 20 minutes, he was almost a lock for 20 points. But as it happened, Mikan fouled out and was ejected. Quite a lot. To this day, he still holds the highest personal fouls per game out of any player over 400 games, at 4.2. To put this in a modern comparison, DeMarcus Cousins averaged 3.7 over his career. Many basketball historians attribute Mikan's fouls to the league's inability to handle a clearly dominant force, reminiscent of the prime Shaq era. Most don't know the fact it was proven Mikan was intentionally targeted by referees, and in some cases, for the explicit purpose of tipping the game for bettors. To dissect these claims, we need to start looking at the league as a whole during that time. The challenger to Mikan's dominance was the fresh-faced Alex Groza, kindly nicknamed the Beak. The 6'7" forward from University of Kentucky came second in the NBA scoring race to Mikan 2 years in a row. He was also the only player in NBA history to make the All-NBA team every year of his career. This would ultimately be because Groza was banned from the NBA for life after a second season in the league. Groza's situation was a unique one, where he had already started his NBA career before the ban had been delivered. In fact, he and Indianapolis teammate Ralph Beard were both in the same boat. Beard and Groza were teammates at Kentucky and part of the team that won back-to-back NCAA championships in 48 and 49. They would both start their first NBA season later that year, coincidentally together on the Indianapolis Olympians after Beard was drafted by Chicago but eventually traded. They were able to play for 2 years before the news broke of their involvement in the college scandal. Before they were kicked out of the league, the pair were involved in a few strange games throughout their short career. One in particular was January 7th, 1951, where the Tri-City Blackhawks hosted the Indianapolis Olympians. The night before, the Olympians played the Rochester Royals and ended up with a jaw-dropping 6 overtimes, a record that still stands to this day, a true testament to the no-shot clock era, as the final score was only 75-73. As a result of their exhausting outing, the Olympians missed their planned passenger train to Illinois and were left in a pickle. There was a commercial flight to Illinois from Rochester, but only 5 seats available on the plane. Coach Cliff Barker selected Alex Groza, Ralph Beard, and 3 others to make the trip, and in turn, he locked in his roster for the game. The 5 Indianapolis players would make tip-off and set the NBA record for the first and only instance of a game being played without subs. Groza and the Olympians would ultimately lose 83-79. Only 2 days after the record breaker, the NBA was under fire from the VP of Madison Square Garden, Ned Irish, who was threatening to ban the league entirely after a questionably rough game between Syracuse and New York. Irish specifically highlighted the poor performance of the officials and called the outing a disgrace. Who was on the whistle that night? Mr. Sol Levy. No more than a week later, Junius Kellogg, a star center at Manhattan College, would blow the lid on one of the biggest coordinated fixing schemes in sport history. With Groza, Beard, and Levy finding themselves eventually entangled in the very same web. Kellogg was approached before his game against DePaul on January 16th and offered $1,000 to shave points. Despite working a minimum wage job at the campus's frozen yogurt shop, he turned down the offer, which was about $10,000 modern day. He would report the bribe to his coach Ken Norton, who in turn connected Junius with the New York District Attorney Frank Hogan. Hogan was familiar with Manhattan College and the dangers of match fixing, as just 2 years earlier he had uncovered a plot where George Washington University co-captain David Shapiro was offered a bribe to throw a game against Manhattan College at MSG. The method in which Hogan actually proved the 49 fixing attempt was like something out of a cheesy movie. He had an older detective pose as Shapiro's uncle and attend the game, where Detective Rumack was able to solicit bribes from the 4 guilty parties. The guilty 4? The first was Joseph Aronowitz, a small-time New York hood turned informer, then turned victim of a gangland-style execution in '55. Then we have Philip Klein, a lowly linotype operator who drifted out of relevance after the incident. Third, we have William Rivlin, a low-level New York gambler who also was implicated as an essential figure in the 51 fixing of Long Island University. He's also a close associate of Jackie Goldsmith, a former Long Island player who was also at the center of the 51 controversy. Goldsmith was said to be responsible for corrupting more players than anyone else in the city. We'll get to him later. Lastly, Jack Levy, said to be the ringleader of the operation out of Miami, Florida, and a relatively big-time bookie, who then relocated to Brooklyn. The hopeful side of me believes there's a chance that Jack and Saul are related, especially since Saul later relocated to Miami himself. But my gut feeling says this is probably just a coincidence, and the last name was incredibly popular for those two cities. Hogan's investigation efforts didn't relent after 1941, and he would continue to pull at the threads that tangled both professional and collegiate basketball. On October 20th, 1951, former Kentucky teammates Barnstable, Beard, and Groza would be arrested for their involvement in a college basketball fixing scheme. This marked the first instance in which members of the wider NBA fraternity were pulled into a scandal of this kind. After being apprehended by authorities on the 20th, the 3 were questioned for 7 hours straight before finally crumbling and admitting their role in the fixing. More specifically, they admitted to throwing an NIT game against Loyola of Chicago on March 14th, 1949. Groza was paid $1,000, while Beard and Kentucky captain Barnstable were paid $500 each. Kentucky were the clear favorites, so much so that the betting line had Loyola as 10-point underdogs. Conveniently, the game ended 67-56, with Kentucky losing by 11 points. The players tipped off authorities to the involvement of Nick the Greek Anglicis and Nat Lovey Brown, the parties who approached the players and coordinated the fix. Both were former collegiate athletes in the New York area, and after their playing careers dried up, they found another way to make a living off the sport. Curiously enough, when the two were picked up by authorities, they admitted to fixing another Kentucky game against Tennessee during the year of 1949, but the players would deny it altogether. Credible sources from the time claim that it was a total of 10 games that were fixed. It turns out that Anglicis was a mediocre football player who played on the Kentucky Wildcats roster during the war, until he was eventually dropped in '46. As would happen, Ralph Beard briefly played on the football team during '45, where the two became pals. Nick became a classic example of a former athlete getting pulled in too deep, most personified by this incredible anecdote of of him and his brother facing death threats from their bosses in the New York mob. As the story goes, Anthony Inglis's was picked up in a cab by his bosses, Jack Zip West and Eli Klufkowski, said to be associates of New York mobster Dutch Schultz. Under threat of death, he followed them to an apartment where he was to call his brother Nick and reverse the planned fix, in order to teach the other guys a lesson. It turned out that word had spread of the tampering, and other gamblers were angling in on the action and eating into profits. Tony called the arena where the Bradley St. Joseph's game was being played, and Nick Inglis was paged over the loudspeaker. In the nick of time, Inglis was able to give a thumbs down to his inside man, Jen Melcore, indicating to go under the spread. Melcore remains another NBA what-if story, as he would eventually be the 1951 first overall pick, but wouldn't play a minute in the league after his lifetime ban was delivered by Maurice Podoloff in November 1951. It's suffice it to say that the criminal underworld was entangled into high-performance sport and loved the unpredictable nature of basketball. So who's to say that the NBA remained untainted during its early years? It was revealed that the NBA commissioner Maurice Podoloff was actually the first to tip off Hogan in September about the involvement of his then players, Ralph Beard and Alex Groza. His reason for coming forward is that he wanted to clean the professional game from the effects of the fix. If Maurice didn't already know the NBA was at risk from the same fixing, he probably wouldn't have been so insistent to have them arrested, and more to the point, the evidence he provided Hogan were records from the NBA. Beard and Groza denied any fixing at the pro level, but were unable to appeal their ban. They'd initially signed a package deal for 70% ownership of the Olympians, but after the scandal broke, they were forced to sell at 10% of their original value. The franchise would fold in '53 after being sold off for $500, and Indiana basketball would return to Hoosier dominance. Some say the punishment was too harsh, but if the pair had coordinated to fix over 10 games at the collegiate level, are we really to believe that their 130 games in the NBA were untouched? After all, every good scheme needs a guy on the inside. We already know that during this era, the NBA had one of its best. Sol Levy. Levy was more than your average neighborhood kid out of Brooklyn. By the time he reffed his first NBA game in '49, he had already been an assistant coach in the NCAA, a ref in the NCAA, and a baseball umpire. His resume after basketball grew even wider, as he would own and operate 3 separate New York newspapers, and play a prominent role in the YHCA organizations of New York. But one stop in his career would prove to be life-changing. When Sol was a physical director at the Williamsburg Y, he became close with a fellow New York native, Eddie Gard. During the dying era of club basketball, he was a coach with the Williamsburg Y, featuring Long Island University players Nat Miller and Eddie Gard to a 31-1 record. Club teams would be able to enter leagues and tournaments as they saw fit, and generally only played close to home. As the war broke out, the coach of Long Island University, Claire B., joined the maritime service at Sheepshead Bay. It was here he would recruit future LIU star Eddie Gard. Miller and Gard were able to get their Williamsburg coach Levy a spot on the LIU coaching staff. Levy was a former player himself at the collegiate level and clearly had a connection with his 2 players. It was here that he got his first taste at a big-time fix. Even before the '51 fixing broke, Levy and the LIU Blackbirds were already being criticized for allegedly working with gamblers. Anecdotes tell of the LIU team being removed from betting boards in New York in the late '40s because of too much money being won on their games in particular. As we learned through the Piston Time series, the bookies are typically the first to recognize any sort of irregularities in the results. And it turns out, the supposed history of over-under betting in basketball is deeply intertwined with many familiar faces from the story. During this era, as many as 500 basketball players from the Northeast would make their way to the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, where they were paid by resort owners to play competitive matches for guests as an attraction. Players would use the opportunity to tune up for the regular season and make valuable networking connections with stakeholders in basketball, basically the 1950s equivalent of the Drew League or the Rico Hines scrimmages. Some of the notable names that would be in attendance included Coach Claire B., Alex Groza, Eddie Gard, George Mikan, and Sol Levy. It also happened to be a hotbed for gamblers to make contact with players, and as it would turn out, the occasional referee. During the Catskill Games, a hat was passed around the bleachers that encouraged guests to guess on the total number of points scored in the game. Players were only paid $40 a week for attending the resort, so it almost became inevitable that they would scheme with guests to shave points, ensuring the gambler reached the desired point total for a cut of the profit. It seems their basketball skills were being sharpened in more ways than one. This was the setting where Eddie Gard would meet New York jeweler and high-stakes gambler Salvatore Sollazzo. Gard had already fixed games while at LIU and had aspirations to plant more seeds of control into New York basketball. The only issue, he needed a bankroll, and Sollazzo was that man. As a pair, they infiltrated countless targets across 2 seasons, and evidently a few referees along the way. They also seemingly corrupted one of the most prominent figures in the fix, former LAU star Jackie Goldsmith. After sitting out his senior year for unknown reasons, Goldsmith jumped 2 feet first into the world of underground crime, and to this day is referred to as the master fixer of the 51 scandal. For sharks like these, you can imagine that they were always on the lookout for new ways to turn a bucket of basketball. So when Sol Levy was named a referee for the inaugural 49th season of the NBA, his benefactors like Sollazzo and Goldsmith were probably licking their chops. Levy's reputation in the league was a fiery one. Even for his relatively short stint in the NBA, he had a knack for being at the center of attention. A story from December 1949 tells of Levy holding up a game between St. Louis and Baltimore because of an issue he had with a fan. At the end of the third quarter, a loose ball entered the crowd. A fan decided to send the ball whizzing back at Sol Levy with some apparent force. Sol must have thought that the pass was a little too strong, as he claimed that the fan was trying to hurt him. After a tussle between Levy, the fan, and Bullets player coach Buddy Jeanette, order was restored and the fourth quarter was played. As for his actual performance as a ref, Levy was feared by coaches and players alike for his tendency to leave his fingerprints on the game, exemplified best by instances like this in a Boston-Philadelphia game on February 23, 1950, where he was responsible for calling 60 fouls, or in this game on November 22, 1949, featuring the Boston Celtics and the Tri-City Blackhawks, where he called 67. Seems to be a trend there. Legendary Celtics coach Red Auerbach may have been the first to suspect that something was up with Levy's officiating. He had the benefit of seeing his fixes firsthand, but it turns out something else may have tipped him off. It was known among inner basketball circles that Eddie Gard was the supposed protege of Sol Levy, his former coach at LIU and the Williamsburg Y. Gard would attend the odd game reffed by Levy, and the two's roots in Brooklyn kept them close. When Gard's involvement in the 51 scandal broke in May, Auerbach's first worry was to what degree Levy had been corrupted. At first, he thought Levy was just incompetent. It turns out, no one can be that bad. When you reimagine this era of the NBA through this lens, things start to seem fishier than ever. You had rosters full of confirmed fixers like Norm Major, Ralph Beard, and Alex Groza. You had referees like Sol Levy laying down their version of the law. The sideline was littered with gamblers, members of organized crime, and anything in between, looking to make a buck off the game by any means. So greats like George Mikan may be downplayed because of the plumber era that they came out of, but Mikan may have been playing against more than just the other team. Mikan attracted such attention that you had games like November 22nd, 1950, where the Pistons attempted to play stall ball to shut out Mikan. They were successful in doing so, winning the game 19-18, holding the Lakers to a single point in the fourth quarter. And it is a game that is now cited as one of the main reasons that the shot clock was implemented. Mikan would score 15 out of 18 of the Lakers' points, to this day the highest percentage share of team points scored in the NBA, more than Kobe's 81-point game or Wilt's 100-point game. Now you may be wondering, who holds the second highest percentage share? None other than Mr. Basketball himself, George Mikan. So it's clear to see why gamblers would attempt to enlist an inside man to slow down the Laker legend. And after Sol Levy was arrested in November 1951, it was proven that he attempted to do just that. Also revealed through a series of court proceedings was the bumbling execution of the scheme, and how Levy only successfully completed half of the attempted fixes. Bearing in mind that we are going off Levy's testimony, where he alleges only 6 games had been targeted in the NBA. One of the failures includes Levy neglecting to tell his moneyman Salvatore Sollozzo which team to bet on before a specific game, because he was unable to get to a payphone in time for tip-off. Levy's approach was to decide on game day which team he was going to favor, and he would relay this information as close to the start time as he could. Imagine the look on the faces of Rochester team officials when they caught Levy in the phone booth 5 minutes before game time during another reported instance. Levy's confession in court would only cover a single month in November 1950, but included 6 attempted fixes. It seems highly unlikely that this was the only month of his career he fixed a basketball game, but the courts would buy it. The timeline of the fix was as follows. November 4th, Minneapolis vs. Washington. Levy managed to foul out Mikan in the fourth quarter, but the Lakers hold on, and Sollozzo loses his $8,000 bet, which is about $100K modern day. Levy would beg Sollozzo for another chance to make right, and a week later, he got that chance. The Celtics take down the Capitals, and both Levy, Sollozzo, and Guard walk away with some profit. The Celtics topple the Olympians, and the Gamblers hit big again. Groza and Beard are present on the losing team, and based on their history, their potential involvement in the fix of this game shouldn't be overlooked. Levy fails to make the difference, and the trio lose their bets once again. Confirmed fixer Norm Major was also present for this game, but it's unlikely he was working for Levy due to the fact that his bullets came out on top. Levy can't turn the tides against the New York Knicks, and the fixers fail once more. Sollozzo was sick and tired of losing with Levy, but stuck with him for another game, whether it was out of loyalty or sunk cost. Levy contributes to the 75 team fouls called this game, with an insane 45 against the Knicks. To no one's surprise, the bet hits. The NBA's head referee, and arguably the most respected at the time, was Pat Kennedy, a 4,000-game veteran who had a penchant for flair. Kennedy testified on Levy's behalf in court that his reputation was good as far as I know, and that none of the fixed games had been protested by the teams involved. A small point that all but confirms the teams had no idea when a game was actually fixed. Kennedy was the same ref that would often reverse Levy's out-of-bound calls, one of the primary tactics used to ensure a result, and had Levy discouraged from fixing any games that they worked together. Another face that popped up during Levy's trial was his moneyman and mob-tied boss, Salvatore Sollozzo. Sollozzo was already looking at 8 to 16 years in prison, and was hoping to reduce his sentence by any means, through confirming Levy's role in the conspiracy. Levy was given up to 3 years in an indeterminate sentence, guilty on 6 accounts of match fixing. But in a miraculous turn, he was the benefactor of a strange loophole within the penal law he was arrested for. It turns out, the law only covered commercial fraud if the guilty party was an employee, and didn't properly account for the referees to be private contractors. Levy's 3-year sentence would be reversed, and he wouldn't spend a day in jail. Levy would return to the world of publishing and community sport, and the black mark on his reputation seemed to fade away as he became a well-respected member of the Williamsburg community. His protege, Eddie Gard, wasn't nearly as lucky. Gard was sentenced to a year at Rikers Island, one of America's most notorious and brutal prisons. Gard was thrown to the Sharks by Levy in court when he claimed that he only fixed games after his protege Gard, 18 years his junior, told him that he placed large bets on the games and was afraid of the consequences of losing. Gard was already found guilty at this point, and Levy picked the easy scapegoat. Almost 75 years later, the league is still wrought with discussions of the sanctity of the game. The Tim Donaghy saga was one of the only modern peeks we've had behind the Iron Curtain of NBA officiating controversies. One of the biggest allegations from his claims was just how widespread these fixing schemes went among fellow refs. By all measures, Donaghy and Levy shared a few things in common. They were both incompetent at covering up their indiscretions, and were brought into the public eye as a result. One of the last thoughts I'd like to leave you with is to consider the possibility that figures like Levy, Groza, and Gard may not have been outliers in the history of professional sport, but a blueprint. Roster constants like Groza and Beard gave the fixers power of the game from the court. But to truly control the game, it was hard to find a better inside man than the person controlling the out-of-bounds, fouls, and 50-50 calls. To the bettors, Levy was a magician, making point spreads disappear out of nowhere. And a catalyst like Gard can connect the players with the true criminals. It begs the question, who is our modern-day equivalent? This formula can be easily replicated, and as of the week of this video being made, the news of the Terry Rozier investigation dropped. Like many others, the wheels began to turn on who else could be implicated, both behind the scenes and on the court. New information has revealed that the suspicious bets placed on Rozier are also connected to both Jontay Porter and several college teams under federal investigation. Just like all of the point-shaving scandals we've covered, the bookies noticed it first. Maybe it's time we take a page out of history and look closer at those who really control the game.